Hello, CHistrue here. It's pre-election, and I'm going to give a little talk on states' rights and utopia. First, let's go with utopia. Utopia is often called no place. But utopia only means no place if no one answers the call. I mean, the word may technically mean no place, and when Utopia was written some hundreds of years ago, I mean, sure, it was no place, but if humanity answers the call, then we can build utopia. But the question is how. Utopians have, generally speaking, been in favor of large centralized power structures that will then deliver a utopian world by way of some kind of benevolence from the top. And that is not the way utopia is built. Utopia is built from below. Utopia is built through local power. This is the eve of an election. And on this election, we have a choice between two candidates to exercise power on the federal level. In the case of Mitt Romney, we have an obvious corporate kind of president who thinks for the 1%. In the case of Barack Obama, we have somebody who is not quite as extreme in that direction. But in both cases, we have to be realistic here, because in both cases, we do have presidents who will not hesitate to engage in unilateral military action without Congress, let's say. So in both cases, we have a country that is going to become more and more militarized, more and more in hock to corporations, more and more restrictive in terms of the liberties we enjoy. I concede that the current president is the lesser of two evils. I mean, there's no question about it. I consider Mitt Romney to be truly frightening. However, I think we can do better. I think we can build utopia. But I think we need to know what utopia is. First of all, there is what utopia is not. Utopia is not some kind of a dictatorship of the proletariat where we hand over our power it's the kind of Orwellian idea that we hand over our power in the name of having our power. That's contradictory. Utopia can only be built from the bottom up. That's the idea, I guess, of the Occupy movement, although they got caught up on sort of a turf, I don't know, they got caught up on certain issues and the movement dissipated. They didn't do enough to expand out and to leave town square and go off into neighborhoods where homes were being foreclosed upon, where they could have easily, quote-unquote, occupied a house that was being foreclosed upon, for say. Now, that would have been a great way to have reached out into the community and gotten support. But I digress. My real point here is a discussion of the idea of local power and the fact that a lot of liberals and progressives are fearful of the idea of local power and states and state power. And there's an obvious reason why. If you go back to the very, very earliest history of states' rights in the United States, sure, it had what you could call liberal dimension to it. You had the Adams administration that was shutting down newspapers, that was stifling dissent, that was tapping into religious bigotry. And then you had the Jeffersonians who were in favor of change, and the Adams administration whipped up a hysteria, an anti-French hysteria, against the Jeffersonians, and used the threat of all these French radical subversives running around to implement almost a kind of a coup against the new republic, where Adams became something akin to a dictator. And so what Jefferson said is, you know what, the state of Virginia is not going to follow this. Your law does not run here. And Jefferson won. And so that's an example of states' rights in its quote-unquote good sense. But it wasn't too soon after that states' rights became more and more synonymous with slavery and more synonymous with segregation. And liberals and progressives stopped favoring states' rights. They started to favor the idea of the federal government reaching down with a benevolent hand and ending these local tyrannies. Because remember, that slavery and segregation, these were not movements that were liberationist in nature. They were not liberating. They were movements that were constrictive. So they were constrictive local movements. They were movements on the part of hegemonic ruling classes to maintain their power. And so the idea of having the broader society step in made a lot of sense. I wouldn't disagree with that. I'm glad Lincoln did what he did. I'm glad that Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson did what they did to end segregation. I'm glad for that. But I also believe that we can't get fixated on the one truth. The one truth being that we have the benevolent, almighty federal government, which is always great, and it's going to stand up for civil rights, and then these local sheriffs who are terrible and they're going to clamp down. And often that's true. I mean, in other words, I'm not saying that narrative doesn't have truth to it. It does. But let's look at the number one civil rights issue in our country today. And this is not just a civil liberties issue, this is a civil rights issue. I'm talking about the war on drugs. Sure, it's a civil liberties issue and a constitutional issue, but the militarization of the police in the name of the war on drugs is also very much of a civil rights issue. It impacts African Americans a lot more heavily than other populations. And trust me, let's put it this way, drugs are very widespread. The usage of drugs is not limited to a particular group in society. So when you have a particular group that is targeted, you have to consider that to be an intent. The intent of this type of a war on drugs was to target certain communities. Okay. Now again, I'm not in favor of total legalization. I think that there's something in the middle. But that's another subject for another video. I am definitely not in favor of the current war on drugs and the militarization of our police. Well, my point in bringing that up is that the war on drugs is not going to change on the federal level. It is not going to change on the federal level at all. It will change on the state level. It has changed on the state level. You actually have victories against the war on drugs happening on the state and local level. It is not happening on the federal level. It is a state and local level where we have this advance in not just civil liberties in the old-time Jeffersonian sense, where you could say that there's a hypocrisy here because they were civil liberties for Caucasian Americans, but not necessarily for others. But in this case, you have not only a victory for civil liberties for college students who want to do whatever they do, but you also have a civil rights victory for people living in primarily African American neighborhoods. I mean, it hasn't been achieved yet. Obviously, we still have, in New York, we still have stop and frisk. But what I'm saying is that there have been victories, and they have happened on the state and local level. So the state and local level can be a laboratory for democracy, as Jefferson suggested, or it can be a laboratory for tyranny. Remember, there is no such thing as a right that doesn't apply to individuals. There's no such thing as states' rights, because the state is a fiction. There's no such thing as the federal government having rights, because the federal government is a fiction. These aren't real. They're like believing in the tooth fairy. They're like believing in the Galactic Federation of Light. They're like believing in any number of salvationist narratives. Only individuals really have rights. In this sense, I'm a classical liberal. I mean, I don't want to be pigeonholed into being, the whole left-right spectrum thing. Okay, in this sense, I'm a classical liberal. Now, I don't necessarily agree with classical liberal economics. That's a different issue. But when it comes to personal liberty, I am a classical liberal. So, if a genuinely emancipationist utopia is going to be built, it has to be built from the bottom up. I'm not going to trust the all-powerful benevolent state. I'm not going to trust mommy and daddy. I'm an adult. Okay, I mean, I love my mother and father, but I don't want them ruling over me. So, this is CHistrue here. Whatever the results of the election would be tomorrow, let's build from the bottom up.